So what I want to talk about today is looking at excellence through the notion of racism, inclusion, and white privilege. So, on the face of it, policy making paints a really good picture. We've had very positive initiatives around policy making. We've had the widening participation agenda introduced by the new Labour government. We've had the Equality Act. We've also had initiatives such as the Athena Swan Charter and more recently the Race Equality Charter. However, within all this positive picture of policy making, much of the policy making has given gender has been given precedence over race. And in terms of policy making, white women have been the main beneficiaries. And looking at the Athena Swan Charter, white middle class women have been the main beneficiaries. So on the face of it, policy making paints a very positive picture regarding inclusion and equity. There's also been an increase in the numbers of black and minority ethnic students attending higher education institutions in the UK, but we must note that there are differences within and between those BME categories. But the group that has seen the most growth has been the black students. However, despite significant advances in policy making, inequalities around racism and exclusion continue to exist. Let me show you the evidence. So if you're a white student, you are more likely to leave university with a first or a 2-1 compared to BME students. As I've said, there's differences within and between those categories. So whilst black students have shown the most significant increase over the last decade, they are the ones who are least likely to leave university with a 2-1 or a first. There is a BME attainment gap of 13.6 percentage points, with the gap being the most widest for black students. And it is different between different ethnic groups. So let's talk about inequality. When BME students achieve good A-level grades compared to white students on average, there are differences within that category. However, these students are less likely to be able to apply to selective universities such as Oxford or the Russell Group. For instance, many state school students are unaware of the processes of applying to Oxford or Cambridge, where the application forms have to go in September, they have to sit an interview, and they have to write an essay. So many students are unaware of these processes, so they are less likely to be able to apply. And when they do apply, they are less likely to be offered places compared to white students with comparable A-level results. And David Lammy has actually argued that this is a system of social apartheid that's going on in relation to elite and Russell Group universities. So BME students continue to be underrepresented in prestige elite Russell Group universities. And there's also evidence to suggest that black students are more likely to drop out of university, citing an ethnocentric curriculum and indeed racism. Those are the tip of the iceberg, and just some examples from 2018 of racism. So I think it's really important to talk about the BME staff demographics in relation to looking at whiteness and white privilege. And there are discrepancies and differences within the experiences of black and minority ethnic staff in higher education. A higher proportion of BME staff, both UK and non-UK, are more likely to be on fixed-term contracts compared to white staff. White academic staff are more likely to earn more on the highest pay spine of $59,500 compared to UK BME staff. UK BME staff are underrepresented at the highest contract levels and overrepresented at the lowest. There are 91.6% professors are white compared to 8.4% of the BME total. Out of 154 higher education institutions in the UK, we only have 3 BME Vice-Chancellors. And a higher proportion of BME staff are on research-only contracts compared to white staff. So I want to talk about policy making in relation to who benefits from this policy making, which seems, as I've already said, seems to paint a very positive picture in terms of looking at equity, diversity, and inclusion. And in my work, I argue that the evidence of excellence is actually seen in universities' adherence to inclusive policy making and practice. So universities can sell themselves as excellent because they can sell themselves as having the badges of excellence, of which one could be the Athena Swan Charter or indeed the Race Equality Charter. And these are seen as badges of excellence. However, I argue that these badges of excellence and this notion of excellence is for the benefit of the universities themselves, so that they can sell themselves as excellence in relation to the number of students that go to the university and the individuals that they recruit. And Derek Bell argues that whites will advance the cause of racial justice only when doing so coincides with their own self-interests. And my colleague David Gilbourne argues that the continued promotion of policies and practices that are known to be racially divisive testifies to a tacit intentionality in the system. So it's no accident that black students are the most disadvantaged. It's no accident that there are very few BME professors. And it's no accident that we only have 3 vice-chancellors in the UK who are from a BME background. Gloria Ladson-Billings argues that whites are the main beneficiaries of educational policy making, even though these policies are designed to serve the marginalised, and white women are the main beneficiaries, have been the main beneficiaries of affirmative action, just like white middle-class women have been the main beneficiaries of Athena Swan. And I argue in my work that as long as white identity and white privilege are not threatened, white groups will be supportive of policy making and diversity and inclusion programs such as affirmative action and the Race Equality Charter, as long as they can maintain their position of white privilege and whiteness. I think it's really important to understand how I view the university or higher education as a white space. And I draw on the work of Kobayashi and Peake, who argue that whiteness itself is a normative identity in which power and privilege are translated by controlling dominant values and institutions, and in particular by occupying a particular space within a segregated landscape. So higher education institutions signify this. And the meaning of race varies from location to location, but it also depends on the set of concerns against which it is prioritised and the other forms of consciousness or modes of reading with which it is ranked and arranged. And in this sense, we have to understand how the white space becomes dominated by the elite and the privileged few. And I argue that higher education institutions are spaces of white privilege which fail to cater for the experiences of BME groups. They employ a rhetoric of inclusion, but one that is rarely evidenced in practice or indeed outcomes. So in some sense, all of this notion of a rhetoric or notion of the fact that we are inclusive and we do care about diversity is one way of looking at what we mean by white excellence. Whiteness in higher education operates as a form of legitimacy in which whites maintain their position of advantage by defending the legitimacy of the system that has led to their own advantageous position within it. So white groups will privilege their own individual rights over others. So in this sense, I argue that excellence in some sense is actually a smokescreen. It's defined as white excellence. There is a belief in a meritocracy. There's a belief that inclusive policy making will make a difference, particularly in relation to outcomes and diversities. But we never see that. We don't see that in the ways in which that's translated to outcomes. So universities continue to play their part in the reproduction and reinforcement of racial and indeed class hierarchies through their rhetoric of inclusion. And this rhetoric of inclusion, I argue, is sold as a form of excellence. So universities can sell themselves as diverse and fair, only as long as their own white privilege remains intact and unthreatened. So how can we move forward in terms of, apart from, I guess, dismantling the system, which not very hopeful for that, how can we move forward in thinking about how universities understand what excellence means? Should we have a redefinition of excellence? And in some sense, I argue that quite often universities sell themselves in terms of equating excellence with inclusion. And clearly, I've given you evidence to show that that is not the case. However, I argue that excellence, we need a redefinition of it, and however it is defined, must be part of a social justice agenda, which has to be at the heart of our mission in higher education, which has to reflect diversity from a global and international perspective, and one that has to benefit staff, students, and the whole academic community. And at the moment, it is failing to do that on all fronts. Thank you.